The 7-year-old boy's arm split open during class, revealing a tattoo underneath his skin that had been growing from within since birth. Miss Eleanor Blackwood froze in horror as young Thomas Schmidt clutched his bleeding arm in the middle of her second-grade classroom at St. Margaret's Elementary School. The children around him scattered, screaming, as dark blood pooled on the polished wooden floor. But it wasn't the blood that made Miss Blackwood's heart stop. It was what she saw beneath the torn flesh. Numbers. Unmistakable bluish-green numbers emerging from under the boy's skin like a message from the grave. The sequence 1, 4, 7, 3, 8, 2 was perfectly formed, not tattooed on the surface, but somehow growing from within his muscle tissue itself. The classroom ascended into chaos. Little Susie Pearson vomited immediately upon seeing the numbers pushing through Thomas's skin. 2 other children fainted, collapsing onto the floor like marionettes with cut strings. Miss Blackwood, a veteran teacher of 27 years who had once calmly handled a classroom snake infestation, found herself backing away until she hit the chalkboard, unable to process what she was witnessing. The numbers pulsated slightly, as if alive, with tiny blood vessels visibly feeding the alien tissue. As Thomas's bloodied sleeve fell away completely, the horrific truth became undeniable. The numbers resembled those forcibly tattooed onto prisoners at Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II. Yet this was 1987 in a small Connecticut town, and Thomas had been born in 1980. When paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, they too recoiled at the sight, one of them crossing himself reflexively despite not being religious. Dr. Howard Kellerman, Chief Medical Examiner for Hartford County and specialist in unusual physical anomalies, with 37 years of medical experience and over 4,000 autopsies performed, was summoned to the school immediately by authorities who couldn't begin to classify what they were dealing with. In all my years of medicine, I have never documented anything that defies biological explanation quite like this case, Dr. Kellerman would later write in his controversial paper that cost him his medical license. The numbers weren't simply on the boy's skin, they were growing from within the dermal layer, composed of actual human tissue with distinct cellular structure different from the surrounding tissue. When touched, they felt warm, warmer even than the boy's feverish skin, as if generating their own heat. Thomas was rushed to Hartford Memorial Hospital as news spread through the small town of Lakeville. Parents frantically called the school, terrified that whatever had afflicted Thomas might be contagious. Principal Margaret Holloway issued a statement attempting to calm fears, but 3 families immediately withdrew their children from St. Margaret's, and attendance dropped by 40% the following day. But what happened next would transform a medical mystery into something far more sinister, pushing the case beyond the realm of biological anomaly and into territory so disturbing that multiple official records were subsequently classified. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Hirsch, had just begun cleaning the wound when Thomas looked up at her with eyes suddenly devoid of their previous pain and terror. The whites had turned a jaundiced yellow, the pupils dilated to unnatural size. In a voice much deeper than any 7-year-old should possess, he spoke 4 words in perfect German. Kommt für dich. He is coming for you. Dr. Hirsch, whose grandparents had survived the Holocaust, dropped her instruments with a loud clatter and backed away from the examination table, knocking over a tray of medical supplies. Her assistant, Nurse Candace Wheeler, would later testify that Dr. Hirsch's face drained of all color, and she began hyperventilating so severely that another doctor had to administer a mild sedative. The medical transcript notes that she immediately requested a psychiatric consultation and removed herself from the case, citing extreme emotional distress and conflict of interest. What made this incident even more disturbing was Thomas's family background. His father, Michael Schmidt, was a quiet, unassuming accountant at a local firm who had immigrated to the United States from Germany in the late 70s. He had met Thomas's mother, Ellen, an American schoolteacher, at a community college where he was taking English classes. They married after a brief courtship, and Thomas was born 2 years later. Neighbors described the family as private but unremarkable, the kind that kept their lawn mowed and exchanged pleasantries but rarely socialized. When authorities contacted Michael Schmidt about his son's condition, his reaction was not what anyone expected. According to the police report filed that day, Michael Schmidt didn't rush to the hospital. Instead, he went home, packed a single suitcase, and disappeared. Security footage from a bank ATM 20 miles away showed him withdrawing his account's maximum daily limit. He then abandoned his car at Hartford bus terminal and vanished completely. He was never seen again. The investigation into Michael Schmidt's background revealed a void where records should have existed. His German citizenship appeared legitimate on the surface, but deeper inquiries by immigration authorities found disturbing inconsistencies. The birth date on his immigration papers showed he was 41 years old when he arrived in America in 1978. However, the address listed for his birthplace in Munich led to a building that had been completely destroyed during Allied bombing in 1944 and never rebuilt. His educational credentials from the Technical University of Munich were impossible to verify, as the records department claimed no student by that name had ever enrolled. Most disturbing of all, the identity number on his German passport belonged to a man named Karl Heimer, who, according to Red Cross records, had died in 1953. Even more chilling was what investigators found hidden in the Schmidt basement. Behind a false wall in the cellar, accessed through a nearly invisible seam in the wood paneling, authorities discovered a small room containing numerous Nazi artifacts. These included an SS uniform with medals indicating high rank, several books on genetic experimentation bound in what forensic analysts would later confirm was human skin, and a leather-bound journal written in a cryptic code that took federal cryptographers 6 months to decipher. The contents of this journal would change everything about the case and lead to one of the most classified investigations in post-war history. But back at the hospital, young Thomas's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The wound on his arm refused to close despite multiple suturing attempts, and the numbers seemed to be becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. Nurses reported that the boy would switch between periods of extreme agitation, during which he would scream about the experiments in fluent German, and eerie calm, where he would stare at the ceiling and recite what sounded like names and dates. During one such episode, Thomas named 17 people, complete with birthplaces and birth dates. FBI agents later confirmed that all 17 were documented Holocaust victims who had died at Auschwitz between 1943 and 1944. None of these names had appeared in history books accessible to the public, and several were from transport lists that had only recently been discovered in Soviet archives, not yet translated or published in English. Dr. Raymond Foster, the chief of pediatric surgery, with credentials from Johns Hopkins and a consultant for several rare genetic disorders, made the decision to sedate Thomas and perform exploratory surgery to understand the nature of the numbers growing beneath his skin. What the surgical team discovered defied all medical explanation and caused 2 surgical nurses to request immediate transfers from the unit. The tissue comprising the numbers had its own vascular system, Dr. Foster stated in his report. It was as if a completely foreign organism had been growing inside the boy since birth, biding its time until it was ready to emerge. Under microscopic examination, the cells appeared to have distinct genetic markers that did not match Thomas's DNA. More disturbing still, when separated from the boy's tissue, the numerical tissue remained viable for 72 hours in laboratory conditions, occasionally exhibiting spontaneous movement. But whose DNA did this bizarre tissue match? The answer would come from an unexpected source and add yet another layer of impossible horror to the already unfathomable case. 3 days after Thomas was admitted to the hospital, an elderly janitor named Ezra Goldstein was cleaning the boy's room while he slept. Goldstein, a Holocaust survivor himself, who had rarely spoken of his experiences, noticed something about the numbers that had now fully emerged on Thomas's arm. He dropped his mop and rushed to find Dr. Henney. Foster, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely press the elevator buttons. "Those aren't random numbers," Goldstein told the doctor, his voice cracking as he rolled up his own sleeve to reveal the faded tattoo on his forearm. "That's my identification number from Auschwitz. I know because I've seen it every day for over 40 years. That's my number on that boy's arm." The statistical impossibility of this coincidence sent shockwaves through the medical team. How could a 7-year-old American boy be growing the exact identification number of a Holocaust survivor he had never met? The implications were too disturbing to contemplate. DNA testing was still in its infancy in 1987, but preliminary tests confirmed what seemed impossible. The tissue forming the numbers contained genetic material that matched Ezra Goldstein's DNA. When this finding was presented to a panel of genetics experts at Harvard Medical School, one professor reportedly tore the report in half and walked out of the room, declaring the entire case an elaborate hoax designed to discredit legitimate science. While medical professionals struggled to make sense of Thomas's condition, federal investigators were making progress with Michael Schmidt's coded journal. The task had been assigned to a special unit within the FBI that typically handled only the most sensitive matters of national security. 3 of the cryptographers worked around the clock for months, and what they uncovered was a history so dark that several investigators requested transfers off the case, citing psychological distress. 2 others required extended psychiatric leave. The journal belonged not to Michael Schmidt, but to Dr. Klaus Wagner, a physician who had worked alongside Josef Mengele at Auschwitz. Unlike Mengele, whose experiments were well documented and often horrifically crude, Wagner had been conducting his own series of more sophisticated experiments, focused on what he called genetic memory transfer. His subjects were primarily children and pregnant women, whom he injected with various compounds derived from the blood and tissue of other prisoners. According to the journal, Wagner had become obsessed with the idea that consciousness and memory could be stored within cellular structures beyond the brain. He believed that trauma created unique patterns in the blood and tissue of victims, patterns that could be harvested, preserved, and later implanted into others. His ultimate goal, expressed with cold scientific detachment throughout the journal, was nothing less than the creation of vessels that could carry forward specific consciousnesses across generations. Wagner's journal detailed horrific experiments where he attempted to imprint the identities of certain prisoners onto others through a process he believed would alter genetic coding. Most subjects died in agony, their bodies rejecting the foreign tissue in violent reactions that Wagner meticulously documented with clinical precision. But the journal noted promising results in a small number of cases where children born to women who had undergone these experiments showed physical manifestations of donor characteristics months or years after birth. The most chilling entry, dated January 12, 1945, read, "Subject 147382 shows remarkable cellular adaptability. Have harvested sufficient material for long-term preservation and future implementation. The 1,000-year Reich may fall, but my work will continue through generations yet unborn. What we cannot achieve through military victory, we shall achieve through biological persistence." The entry was accompanied by a photograph of a gaunt man strapped to an examination table, with the number 14738 clearly visible on his arm. FBI agents confirmed through archive photographs that this man was a younger Ezra Goldstein. The investigation now focused on determining if Michael Schmidt was actually Klaus Wagner, who would have been in his 70s by 1987. Age analysis of photographs and handwriting comparisons suggested this was unlikely. Instead, authorities began to consider a more disturbing possibility: that Michael Schmidt was himself the product of Wagner's experiments, perhaps even his biological son, continuing his father's horrific legacy through his own child. Back at the hospital, Thomas's condition was becoming increasingly bizarre and medically inexplicable. The wound around the numbers had finally begun to heal, but the boy was now exhibiting knowledge he couldn't possibly possess. He described in perfect detail the layout of Auschwitz barracks, the daily routines, and specific events that had occurred there. He knew the names of guards and doctors who had never been mentioned in any publication accessible to the public. During one particularly disturbing episode, Thomas began screaming in terror, describing a medical procedure being performed on him, or rather on Ezra Goldstein, by a doctor whose description matched that of Klaus Wagner. The level of detail was so accurate and specific that Goldstein, who was present during this episode, collapsed and had to be treated for shock. When he regained consciousness, the elderly man confirmed that Thomas had described in perfect detail a procedure that had been performed on him in 1944, one he had never spoken about to anyone, not even his own wife. He knew things, Goldstein later testified in a closed hearing before a special congressional committee. Things about that place that were never in books or movies, things only someone who had been there would know. He described the exact pattern of a crack in the ceiling above my bunk that I used to stare at every night. He knew about the small bird nest outside the window of the laboratory where Wagner conducted his experiments. How is that possible? How can this child know these things unless something of me is alive inside him? Child psychologists who evaluated Thomas suggested he might be experiencing some form of dissociative identity disorder, perhaps triggered by abuse that had caused him to create an alternate personality based on stories he had heard. But this theory couldn't explain the physical manifestation of the numbers, nor the precise historical knowledge that even historians had verified was accurate down to minute details that weren't part of the public record. 5 weeks after his admission to the hospital, Thomas began to complain about pain in his back. "It hurts when I sit," he told the nurses, tears streaming down his face. "There's something coming. There's something inside me trying to get out." Medical imaging revealed what appeared to be foreign tissue growing along his spine, similar to the material that had formed the numbers on his arm. The MRI technician refused to continue the scan, reporting that the tissue appeared to be moving deliberately during the imaging process. Dr. Foster decided against further surgery, fearing it might accelerate whatever process was occurring. Instead, he ordered round-the-clock monitoring and documentation of every change in the boy's condition. What happened over the next 72 hours was recorded by multiple medical professionals and remains one of the most controversial case studies in modern medicine, so disturbing that the full documentation is still restricted to medical professionals with special clearance. The tissue along Thomas's spine began to form what looked like letters, not random scarification, but precise characters in the same bluish-green color as the numbers on his arm. Over 3 days, a complete sentence emerged. Die Experimente werden fortgesetzt. The experiments continue. During this time, Thomas began speaking exclusively in German, a language his mother confirmed he had never learned or been exposed to at home. He referred to himself as Ezra and could recall specific memories from Goldstein's life in Poland before the war. The taste of his mother's challah bread, the sound of his father's voice as he read from the Torah, the name of his childhood dog. When shown photographs of Goldstein's family members who had perished in the Holocaust, people whose images had never been published and whom Thomas could not possibly have seen. He correctly identified each one by name and relation. Ellen Schmidt, Thomas's mother, was eventually admitted to the psychiatric ward of the same hospital, unable to cope with what was happening to her son. In her delirium, she revealed that Michael had always been strangely interested in their son's development, keeping detailed records of every physiological change and collecting blood and tissue samples during minor childhood injuries, which he stored in a private freezer. She also disclosed that Michael had insisted Thomas sleep in a special room lined with copper mesh to shield him from outside interference, though she had never understood what that meant. The case took an even darker turn when investigators analyzing Wagner's journal made a breakthrough in the coded sections. Wagner hadn't just been experimenting with genetic transfer. He believed he had discovered a method of consciousness preservation, a way to ensure that certain individuals would, in his words, return through the bloodline of future generations. The most disturbing aspect was his ultimate goal, not just to preserve the memories and identities of Holocaust victims as some twisted memorial, but to ensure that aspects of superior Aryan consciousness could survive the fall of the Third Reich and re-emerge decades later. Wagner had apparently injected himself with the same compounds he used on his victims, believing this would allow some essence of his consciousness to emerge in his descendants. The journal's final entries suggested he had impregnated several women with what he called treated genetic material before fleeing Germany as the Allied forces closed in. "My children will carry forward what cannot be preserved in books or artifacts," he wrote. "And when the time is right, what sleeps within them will awaken." And was Thomas Schmidt have been the result of these pregnancies? And was Thomas now manifesting not just Ezra Goldstein's memories and physical markings, but possibly aspects of Wagner himself? The investigators handling the case began to suspect a horrifying truth, that Thomas was being used as a vessel for multiple consciousnesses, locked in some kind of internal battle beyond our comprehension. The answer seemed to come on the 49th day after Thomas's initial incident at school. The boy, who had been relatively calm for several days, suddenly began screaming in the middle of the night. His cries echoed through the hospital corridors with such primal terror that 3 patients in adjacent rooms had to be sedated. Nurses rushed in to find him clawing at his chest, tearing his hospital gown to expose his skin with such violence that his fingernails had broken off in the flesh. There, emerging just over his heart, were the distinct outlines of an SS insignia, forming from within, just as the numbers and German text had done. But unlike the previous manifestations, this one was accompanied by a high fever and signs of severe infection. The tissue looked necrotic, blackening at the edges as if Thomas's body was fighting against it. The boy's temperature reached 105 degrees, a level that should have caused brain damage, yet he remained lucid, alternating between screaming in German and pleading in English for someone to make it stop. Dr. Foster immediately ordered ice packs and antipyretics to reduce the fever, but nothing worked. The hospital's infectious disease specialist, Dr. Yvonne Chen, observed that the tissue around the emerging insignia appeared to be engaged in some kind of cellular war, with Thomas's immune system attacking the foreign tissue more aggressively than it had with the previous manifestations. In the midst of this crisis, as doctors fought to stabilize the boy, Thomas's eyes suddenly cleared. The fever-induced glaze disappeared, and his pupils returned to normal size. Looking directly at the attending physician, he spoke in perfect English, not the voice of a traumatized child, but with the clear diction of an adult man. "Listen carefully," he said, grabbing the doctor's wrist with unexpected strength. "I am Ezra Goldstein, the Nazi doctor who did this to me, to us. He found a way to bind our souls together. He's trying to come back through the boy, but I've been fighting him from inside. Wagner wants to return, to continue his work through new bodies, new generations. I don't have much time. You must find his other children. There are more of us, more victims trapped inside them. Look for the numbers. Always look for the numbers. The attending physician, Dr. Morris Abramovitz, backed away from the bed, visibly shaken. Two nurses witnessed Thomas's body suddenly go rigid, his back arching so severely that hospital staff feared his spine would snap. A guttural sound emerged from his throat, a sound that the audio recording, later analyzed by linguistic experts, identified as containing phonemes from at least 3 distinct languages spoken simultaneously. When the seizure finally subsided, the boy fell into a coma from which he would not wake for 17 days. During this time, the SS insignia that had begun to form on his chest gradually receded, leaving behind scarred tissue that periodically bled without any apparent cause. EE readings showed brain activity patterns that neurologists described as impossible, as if multiple distinct consciousness patterns were active simultaneously in different regions of Thomas's brain. While Thomas lay unconscious, federal investigators followed the lead about other children. They began searching for cases similar to Thomas's, children with unexplained physical manifestations or knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. The investigation, codenamed Operation Inheritor, spanned 3 continents and involved cooperation from Mossad, who had been tracking former Nazi scientists since the end of the war. Within 2 months, they had identified 7 potential cases across the United States, Canada, and Argentina, all children born to men who had emigrated from Germany after World War II. Each child exhibited strange physical or psychological anomalies that local doctors had attributed to rare genetic disorders or psychological conditions. All 7 fathers had disappeared within days of their children's first manifestations, just as Michael Schmidt had vanished. 2 of these children had already died under mysterious circumstances, their bodies cremated before any detailed examination could be performed. But one 11-year-old girl in Buenos Aires had recently been hospitalized after numbers spontaneously appeared on her forearm, numbers that matched the Auschwitz identification of a woman who had died in the camp in 1943. The girl's father, a German immigrant named Friedrich Keller, had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide, though the autopsy revealed anomalies in his brain tissue similar to those later found in the genetic samples recovered from the Schmidt basement. Meanwhile, Ezra Goldstein had become a regular visitor at Thomas's hospital bedside. The elderly man would sit for hours, holding the comatose boy's hand and speaking to him quietly in Yiddish. Hospital staff reported that during these visits, Thomas's vital signs would stabilize, and the strange fluctuations in his brain activity would temporarily normalize. On the 12th day of the coma, Goldstein brought an old family photograph showing his parents and siblings before the war. He placed it on Thomas's chest, and within minutes, tears began streaming from the boy's closed eyes, though he showed no other signs of consciousness. When Thomas finally awoke on the 17th day, something had fundamentally changed. The SS insignia that had begun to form on his chest was gone, the skin smooth and unblemished as if it had never been there. The numbers on his arm, however, remained, though they no longer appeared raised or inflamed. They looked like an ordinary tattoo, indistinguishable from the kind forcibly given to concentration camp prisoners. More remarkable still was Thomas himself. He remembered nothing of the past 7 weeks. He didn't recognize Ezra Goldstein, couldn't speak a word of German, and showed no knowledge of Auschwitz or the Holocaust beyond what an average 7-year-old might know. Psychological evaluations showed no signs of trauma or personality disorder. For all intents and purposes, he was simply Thomas Schmidt again, a normal second-grade boy wondering why he was in a hospital and where his father had gone. The medical staff was baffled. Brain scans showed normal activity. Blood tests revealed no abnormalities, and the strange tissue that had formed the numbers now appeared to be ordinary human skin, though slightly discolored. It was as if whatever had possessed the boy had either gone dormant or been expelled completely. Ezra Goldstein, upon seeing this transformation, wept openly. "It's over," he told Dr. Foster. "For now, at least, it's over. Something happened in there, something I can't explain. But I felt it. I felt myself leaving him, returning to just me. But there was something else, too. Something fighting against me, against us both. And I don't think it's gone forever. It's just waiting." The federal investigation into Michael Schmidt and Klaus Wagner continued for years, though much of it remains classified to this day. What we do know is that in 1992, Argentine authorities discovered a remote compound outside Bariloche, where several elderly men had apparently lived for decades. Among the items recovered was a laboratory containing equipment for genetic research far beyond what should have been available in the 1940s or 50s, along with preserved tissue samples labeled with Auschwitz prisoner numbers. Most disturbing were the nursery rooms, where investigators found evidence that at least 20 children had been raised in isolation before being placed with adoptive families across the Americas. Documentation suggested these children had been the subjects of ongoing experiments from birth, with regular treatments administered according to protocols outlined in journals nearly identical to the one found in Michael Schmidt's basement. All the compound's residents were dead by the time it was discovered, having committed suicide through a mass cyanide poisoning reminiscent of how many Nazi leaders chose to end their lives rather than face capture. One of the bodies was eventually identified as Klaus Wagner, though he would have been well over 90 years old at the time of his death. Forensic analysis revealed surgical modifications to his face and fingerprints, confirming he had evaded capture for nearly 5 decades through carefully constructed false identities. As for Thomas Schmidt, the official record shows he was eventually adopted by a family in Oregon after his mother suffered a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. His school records indicate a normal educational progression with no further unusual incidents. He graduated high school in 1998 and disappeared from public records thereafter, presumably having changed his name to escape the notoriety of his case. Ezra Goldstein passed away in 1995 at the age of 73. In his final interview, given to a graduate student researching Holocaust survivors, he made a cryptic statement that has haunted investigators ever since. "The boy was just the beginning. Wagner found a way to preserve more than memories. Those of us who were there, parts of us are still there, still suffering, still trapped. And they're waking up. God help us all. They're waking up." This statement might have been dismissed as the ramblings of an elderly man still traumatized by his past, except for what happened in the following decades. The Schmidt case remains one of the most disturbing examples of unexplained physiological phenomena in modern medical literature, though mainstream science has largely dismissed it as a complex hoax or case of mass hysteria among the medical staff and investigators involved. The official position of the American Medical Association, issued in a confidential memo to hospital administrators in 1990, was that the case represented a disturbing example of suggestibility and collective delusion in a clinical setting, and should not be included in medical education. Dr. Kellerman, who lost his medical license after publishing his paper on Thomas's case, maintained until his death in 2011 that everything he documented was true. His final publication, released posthumously, included previously unseen photographs of the tissue samples taken from Thomas's arm, showing cellular structures that still defy explanation by contemporary medical standards. The paper was retracted by the journal 1 week after publication, and all physical copies were recalled, though several are rumored to remain in private collections. Dr. Foster continued to practice medicine, but never spoke publicly about the case again. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 2008, revealed that he had been quietly tracking similar cases for decades. The journals were confiscated by federal authorities within hours of being found by his daughter, who reported that men in dark suits arrived at her home before she had even finished calling her father's lawyer about the discovery. In 2017, a storage unit in Hartford, Connecticut, was auctioned after its rent went unpaid for over a year. Among the contents, the buyer discovered a sealed metal container with biohazard markings. Inside was a preserved tissue sample labeled only with the number 147382, Ezra Goldstein's Auschwitz identification number. Genetic testing performed on this sample showed DNA that couldn't be classified as fully human, containing sequences that one geneticist described as theoretically impossible. The buyer, a college student named Mark Williams, attempted to contact authorities about his find but reportedly received no response. 3 weeks later, Williams was killed in what police classified as a random mugging, though his wallet and phone were found still on his person. The metal container and its contents disappeared from the evidence room at Hartford Police Department before it could be transferred to the state crime lab. Perhaps most disturbing of all was a recent development in 2021 when a 34-year-old teacher in Portland, Oregon, was hospitalized after students noticed blue-green numbers emerging from beneath the skin on his forearm during class. The man, whose name has been withheld by authorities, reportedly told doctors he was adopted as a child and had no knowledge of his biological parents. The numbers on his arm matched those of a Holocaust victim who died at Auschwitz in 1944. Medical imaging revealed tissue formations throughout the man's body, concentrated primarily in his brain and spine, with a cellular structure that one doctor described as unlike anything in modern medical literature. The case was quickly taken over by federal authorities, and all records were sealed under national security protocols. The teacher has since disappeared from public view, with neighbors reporting that his house was emptied overnight and all social media accounts deleted. As of this reporting, 7 similar cases have been documented across North America and Europe, all involving individuals born between 1980 and 1985. In each case, the numbers correspond to actual Holocaust victims, all of whom were subjects in the experimental block where Klaus Wagner conducted his research. Each manifestation has been more severe than the last, with the most recent case involving a woman who reportedly began speaking in 5 different languages simultaneously, all describing the same medical procedure in precise detail from different perspectives. What really happened to Thomas Schmidt in that Connecticut classroom 36 years ago? Was it an elaborate hoax, a bizarre medical anomaly, or evidence of something far more sinister? The possibility that consciousness itself might somehow be preserved and transmitted across generations. Could Wagner's twisted experiments have actually achieved what he claimed in his journal? Is it possible that the victims of Auschwitz, and perhaps even their tormentors, continue to exist in some form, emerging through the descendants of those involved in Wagner's experiments? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, if Thomas wasn't the only child affected by whatever Wagner did, how many others are out there, carrying within them the suffering and memories of Holocaust victims? Or worse, the malevolent consciousness of the monsters who tormented them? Could Wagner's experiments have created a kind of immortality, ensuring that the ideologies and individuals of the Third Reich could survive its military defeat, lying dormant until conditions allow them to re-emerge? In 2023, researchers at the University Hospital of Zurich published findings from a genetic study showing that extreme trauma can cause alterations in DNA that may be passed down through generations, what they called inherited memory at the cellular level. The study was quickly retracted without explanation, and 3 of the researchers resigned their positions without public comment. One was reportedly admitted to a psychiatric facility after suffering what colleagues described as a complete psychological breakdown, during which he repeated one phrase over and over: "They're all still here. They never left." What would you do if you discovered strange markings growing beneath your skin? Do you believe consciousness could somehow be passed down through generations, carrying memories that aren't your own? Like this video if you were disturbed by Thomas's story, and leave a comment with your theories about what really happened to him. Subscribe to our channel for more dark chapters of history that mainstream historians don't want you to know about. Remember, some secrets don't stay buried forever. Sometimes they emerge from within.